We're going to continue our study of the chapter or the book of Luke this morning, his gospel. We got through verse 30 of chapter 13 last week, so we'll be in verse 31 of Luke chapter 13. You know, when we look at the dialogues, we've seen this kind of as Jesus is being confronted more and more by the Jewish leadership, the Pharisees and scribes and so forth. When we look at the dialogues between him and them, you would almost swear that they were basing their opinions on two different holy books. You know, I mean, it's almost like they were coming from two entirely different religions, if you will. They were speaking two entirely different languages. It's amazing how they could come look at the same thing and come to two entirely different conclusions, isn't it? For example, there was this language teacher that was explaining to her class, French class, and she was explaining to them that with French nouns, they have some sort of a gender article that's associated with them. For example, the word house in French is feminine, so it would be la maison. And the word pencil in French is masculine, so it would be les crayons. And she was explaining this to him, and so one of the students asked her what the gender of a computer would be. And she didn't know, and she looked in her French dictionary and didn't see anything in there. So she decided that for fun, she split the class into two separate groups, and it was right along gender lines. So she had the boys on one side and the girls on the other, and they were supposed to discuss it and come to an understanding of which gender a computer would be. And so the boys decided that the computer should be definitely a feminine gender, which would be les computers or la computer, because, well, before I get into that, I know I'll be getting some very snide emails afterwards saying that the French word for computer is not computer. I get that. It's the word ordinateur, but roll with me, okay? This is a joke. So the boys said that it would be a female because no one but their creator understands their internal logic. And number two, that the native language they use to communicate with other computers is incomprehensible to everyone else. And number three, even the smallest mistakes are stored in long-term memory for possible later review. And as soon as you make a commitment to one, you find yourself spending half your paycheck on accessories for it. Yeah. Well, the girls group concluded that the computer should definitely be masculine or les computers, because in order to do anything with them, you first have to flip their switch. They have a lot of data, but still can't think for themselves. They're supposed to help you solve problems, but half the time they are the problem. And then number four, as soon as you commit to one, you realize that if you'd have waited just a little longer, you could have gotten a better model. Wasn't that funny, Glenda? Okay. So the scribes and the Pharisees were the interpreters of the law. They looked at the law of the Old Testament, and then they were the ones that interpreted and determined for everyone what was to be the case. And more often than not, their interpretation fit into their own predispositions of their self-styled religious constructs. And, you know, for example, just this past week, I've been reading a lot of Jewish commentaries concerning the messianic prophecies in the Old Testament. And it's amazing how they would spin those away from their obvious meanings. That's something we need to guard ourselves against. It's what the Bible guys call eisegesis, reading into the text. And I think we all kind of need to be wary of that so that we don't fall victim of it ourselves. But continuing verse 31 of chapter 13, it says, on that very day, some Pharisees came saying to Jesus, get out and depart from here, for Herod wants to kill you. So these Pharisees, these guys that have been gunning for him for several chapters now in our text, they come to him and they want to do Jesus a solid. They want to come up and give him a little bit of help. It says, you need to leave because we overheard Herod saying that he's going to kill you, that he wants to kill you. And so Jesus immediately booked a flight on LL Airlines for Buenos Aires, right? No. That's what I would do. But that's not what Jesus did. Because he says to them in verse 32, go tell that fox. Now, he wasn't saying Jesus was good looking. Okay. He wasn't saying, Jesus wasn't saying that Herod was good looking when he says, go tell that fox. He was simply, he says to, what these guys most likely had been sent by Herod in order to scare him because he didn't want to have to deal with him. He wanted to scare him out of Judea because he didn't want to have to deal with the Jesus issue. This is the same Herod that had called for John the Baptist's martyrdom. His head was given to him on a platter. And he was scared to death about Jesus. He first thought that it was John the Baptist who had come back to life. And he was afraid that God was going to judge him through Jesus. And so he didn't want Jesus around. So he probably sent these Pharisees to say this to him. And Jesus said, well, you just go tell that fox that, behold, I cast out demons and perform cures today and tomorrow, and then the third day, and I shall be perfected. Now, Jesus wasn't giving 3 literal days here. He's not going to say, I'm doing it today and then tomorrow, and then on the next day, it's all over. He wasn't saying that. But the word perfected here, teleao, a better translation of it, a better understanding would be completed. I'm still working. I got a day or two left, just a short time left, he's saying. And then it'll all be completed. If you're reading from the New American or from the New International versions of the New Testament, it says, on the third day I will reach my goal. And the New Living Translation says, I will accomplish my purpose. So he's just saying, I got a few days left, and then it's all going to be done. I'll have it all wrapped up. But nevertheless, that hasn't happened yet. So today, I must journey today, tomorrow, and the day following, for it cannot be that a prophet should perish outside of Jerusalem. Now, if you read the Old Testament, you'll find there were a lot of prophets that perished outside of Jerusalem. So he wasn't speaking ignorantly, nor was he speaking very literally. What he was saying is, this prophet, it cannot be that this prophet, meaning himself, would perish outside of Jerusalem, because he had to go offer himself as a sacrifice on Mount Moriah, which is part of the Temple Mount, the ridge that the Temple Mount was built on. And he says, and then as soon as he says this, when he says it's not right that a prophet cannot perish outside of Jerusalem, I can't die outside of Jerusalem. I have to go there so that I can be delivered over to the authorities, so that I can be crucified on Mount Moriah and die for the sins of mankind. And as he says this, when he says it's this prophet cannot perish outside of Jerusalem, and then he goes into this lament over Jerusalem, where he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem." I oftentimes wish that we had some sort of recording of the Bible times, some sort of audio, at least audio, where we could hear the tone of voice in which the speakers in the Old Testament or in the Bible used, especially Jesus. I'd love to hear the tone of voice with which he says things. And I know that he's weeping now as he begins to weep and mourn over Jerusalem. And you can just hear the pathos and the sorrow in his voice as he says, "Oh, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, one who kills the prophets and stones those who are sent to her. How often I wanted to gather your children together, just like a hen gathers her brood under her wings, but you were not willing." He says, "You, Jerusalem, Jerusalem, you who kills and stones the prophets and those who are sent." The word kills and stones both are present participles. He says, "You who are killing and are stoning those that the Father sends." He sends out of his love for you. He sends these prophets to warn you and to change your course of direction and to bring you back into his fold. And just like a mother hen would have would gather her chicks under her wings. That's how often I wanted to do that with you, but you weren't willing. And the words kill and stones are in the present participle. You are killing and you are stoning those who the Father sends. You don't know how often I've wanted to do this. And the word want here, wanted, is the word thelo. And it's a pretty common word throughout the New Testament. And it means to want or to will or to desire something. It's very similar to our English word want. I mean, it's a good translation. You don't know how often I've wanted to do this. But you weren't willing. And the word willing is the same word, thelo. I would have, but you weren't. In fact, it's the same word that is used up in verse 31 of Herod, where Herod says that he wants to kill you. Same word. But you weren't willing. I've wanted to, but you wouldn't do it. You know, Peter tells us in his second epistle that it's not God's will that any should perish. And that's the word will there, that's the word thelo, used in 2 Peter chapter 2 as well, or chapter 3. And he says it's not God's will that any should perish, but that all would come to repentance. He doesn't want to see men lost. He doesn't want people to reject him. He doesn't want to send people to hell or to see people go to hell. He doesn't want that. He wants everyone to come into a saving knowledge of His Son, Jesus. And I think it's, what does it take to get to heaven? It's not His will that any perish. It's His will that everybody goes to heaven. What does that take? And I think before we answer that, let's look at what it doesn't take. Okay? There are some, I'll just list 4 common misconceptions about what getting to heaven is not. For example, one thing it's not is church membership. And there are a lot of people, there are churches that even teach that. If your name is on the membership rolls, if you are a member of this church, then you're saved. In fact, they would just say that if your parents are a member of the church and you get born, you're born into the church because they're members of the church. No, being a member somewhere doesn't. You might have its privileges, but heaven's not one of them. That doesn't do it. Church membership never saved anyone. And second, another misconception a lot of people have is it's not geography. And what do you mean by that? And I see this a lot through the Bible Belt. People think that because they are members of the Bible Belt, they don't even have to be a member of the church. They don't even have to go to church. They don't even have anything to do with church. They just live in the Bible Belt. And they've got a really devout Aunt Tilly who prays for them quite often. And that's all it takes because of where they live. God bless Oklahoma, kind of a thing. And geography doesn't save anybody. And here's one that may be kind of a shocker to a lot of people, but even being God's elect doesn't save anybody. You say, what do you mean by that? I thought that's the elect or the saved. Well, Israel was God's elect, right? That's a very repeated theme throughout the Bible is that God has chosen Israel. The word elect means to choose. It's the word chosen. And Israel is God's chosen. He has chosen Israel, and He's saying that of the Israelites, of those in Jerusalem, you don't know how much I would have wanted to gather you to myself, but you weren't willing. You rejected that. I chose you. I elected you, but you rejected that. There is a school of thought that says that God chooses some people to be saved and then by default chooses other people to not be saved. And I've heard all of the arguments that those who adhere to that, what they say, how they try to explain that away. They don't say that, okay, God predestined some to be saved, but He doesn't predestine people to be hell because they're going to hell anyway. And so He doesn't predestine anybody good. But, you can slice and dice it, and you can spin it just the way the Pharisees were spinning the Old Testament. But if you say that God chooses some people to be saved, and they're going to be saved because God chose them, then by default, you have to say that He chooses some people not to be saved. There's no other way around that. And being God's elect doesn't necessarily make... I just put it this way. If you're here this morning, you are God's elect. Now, what you do with that, God has chosen you. And what you do with that is your choice. He's initiated it. He's made the provision, and whatever you do with that is up to you. And I think this verse pretty much makes it clear that being elect doesn't get the job done. And the last thing that doesn't get you into heaven, that's a misconception about what it takes to get into heaven, is believing the gospel. Well, no, Jesus said, whoever believes in me will not perish but have everlasting life. Yeah. And James says even the demons believe. And they tremble. You think there's any demons that are in heaven? There's a difference between believing something and believing into something. And when Jesus says, whoever believes in me, the word is believes into me, will not perish but have everlasting life. Believing something just means you believe it's a fact. You just think it's true. Well, the demons think it's true. The devil thinks it's true. The devil knows it's true more than we know it's true. But he ain't saved because he doesn't believe into Jesus. And he, by virtue of his calling, by virtue of his election of us, he says, okay, I call you just like a mother hen calls her chicks, wants to allow them escaping from whatever the danger may be. If there's a problem, she makes this sound and all the chicks know that they're supposed to go to mama, and then she raises her wings and they crawl up underneath them, and then they're safe. And he says, I have called you to that, and I implore you to choose to come under the covering of my wings. And that's not just simply believing something to be true. That chick can be over on the other side and say, I believe that mom's wings are going to save me. I believe that that's a safe place. And then she gives the warning, and then the chick stays there at the outside of the barnyard. Believing that mom's wings are a safe place doesn't do it any good. You got to get under the wings. It takes a willingness to surrender. It takes a willingness that God has made this provision, and so we are going to accept it by laying it down, and then we pick it up. We lay our lives down, and then we pick up his life in exchange. And so he continues through this weeping monologue that he's giving over Jerusalem. He says, see, verse 35, see, your house is left desolate, is left to you desolate. And assuredly I say to you that you shall not see me until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, there is going to be a time real shortly. Jesus has set his face toward Jerusalem. In fact, he's on the outskirts of Jerusalem now, if you will. And we're entering into the last week of the Lord's life. And if you remember when he comes in on the triumphal entry, riding on the donkey, and that's what they shout. They say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And we think, well, that's a fulfillment of what Jesus is saying here in Luke 13. No, because just a couple of days later, those very same people cry out, crucify him. And Zechariah prophesies that the day will come when their eyes will be open and they realize that this person that they have pierced, and Zechariah prophesies that this person that they have pierced will realize that he is the Messiah, and they will weep for him as a mother weeps for their only son. And then they will cry out, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. And so this is what Jesus is talking about. You're not going to see, he prophetically speaking here, you have rejected me. And so you won't see me until you cry, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. In chapter 21, we won't get there obviously for a few weeks, but in chapter 21, verse 24, this is the Olivet Discourse, if you're familiar with Matthew 24 and 25. This is Luke's version of that. And he says in verse 24 of Luke 21, and they shall fall by the edge of the sword and be led away captive into all nations, and Jerusalem shall be trampled by Gentiles. And then at the end of the verse, he says, until the fullness or the times of the Gentiles are fulfilled. Now, this times of the Gentiles prophetically began on August 30th, AD 70, when the walls of Jerusalem fell, the temple was destroyed, and Titus Vespasian, the Roman general, came in and took over the whole city. And that was the beginning of the fulfillment that Jerusalem will be trampled until the time of the Gentiles is fulfilled. And that began on August 30th, AD 70, and it continued until July 7th, 1967, what has been termed the Six-Day War, the 67 Six-Day War, when for the first time in over 2,000 years, the Israeli flag, the flag of Israel, flew over Jerusalem. And the period in between, from the fall of Jerusalem until the victory in the Six-Day War, that's known as the times of the Gentiles. Okay? And he says, you won't see me, not if you say it, but until you say. Until the time comes when you say, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now, this is not Luke 1:24 is not to be confused with Romans 11:25, where Paul writing, and he says to them, For I do not desire, brethren, that you should be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion. We looked at this last Wednesday night when we were studying Daniel 9. And this is Paul writing to the Gentile church there in Rome, and he's explaining to them how the Israeli people, the Jewish people, have been set aside for a period of time so that the Gentile, the Romans, if you will, and the Oklahomans could be brought in. And he says that don't be ignorant of this mystery, lest you should be wise in your own opinion, that blindness in part has happened to Israel until the fullness of the Gentiles has come in. There's a difference between the times of the Gentiles and the fullness of the Gentiles. They're similar in as far as the scope of time, but they are different. The fullness of the Gentiles, the times of the Gentiles began on, as I said, August 30th, AD 70, and was concluded on June 7th, 1967. The fullness of the Gentiles, however, began with the resurrection and continues on until the rapture. You know, what we could call the church age, or you could say began on the day of Pentecost. Whenever you want to say the beginning of the church, but then, and it continues until the rapture. So they're similar as far as the time span, but they have two different focuses. One is the times of the Gentiles at the time that God puts his attention on the Gentiles. He sets Israel aside so that he can focus on the Gentiles. The fullness of the Gentiles is when every Gentile who's going to get saved in the church age gets saved, and it's full. You know, God has a predetermined number of those who will be saved, and when that number is reached, then the church age effectively ends. The church is raptured, and then he once again turns his attention back to the Jews so that they can come to the place where they will declare, blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord. Now it happened, verse 1 of chapter 14, that as he went into the house of one of the rulers of the Pharisees to eat bread on the Sabbath, that they watched him closely. This is another setup, you know. Turn the page, another chapter, but it's the same as the chapter before. It's the Jewish leadership. It's the Pharisees trying to find some way that they can trip Jesus up. This isn't just a Pharisee, though. It says here that he's a ruler of the Pharisees. You know, ever since Jesus had pronounced his woes to the Pharisees, woe to you Pharisees, that's back in chapter 11. Only like 3 chapters ago, but it was a long time earlier, in our study anyway. And ever since he did that, the scribes and the Pharisees, you know, he said, woe to you scribes and Pharisees. And they've been gunning for him ever since then. They've been trying to find some way that they can point a finger and take him. But instead of repenting when he pointed his finger at them and said, woe, instead of repenting as they should have, they retaliated. And this is just one more example of that. I mean, it's usually either or. You know, whenever God points out one of our failures, we either repent or we retaliate. Usually we try to shoot the messenger, but it's one of the other, isn't it? We either repent or we fight back. And the Pharisees didn't want to repent. And this guy, as I said, wasn't just a Pharisee. He was one of the main dudes. I mean, he wasn't like a full bird Pharisee. He was a 3-star Pharisee, you know. I mean, this guy was he was one of their generals. He had more muck than the other muckety mucks, if you will. I mean, he was the president of the Stuffed Shirt Legalistic Society for the Preservation of Judgmentalism. You know, that's who this guy was, and he invited Jesus to come and have dinner with him. I mean, this is one of the this guy is wanting to kill Jesus, and he's invited him to dinner, and Jesus accepts. As we've seen, Jesus never turned down an invitation to dinner. I mean, after all, he was the founder of Calvary Chapel. But but that's not why he comes. Okay, we're going to see that he didn't come just because they were serving some good shawarma and baklava. You know, I mean, he wasn't going to turn that down, but that's not why he came. He came because there was a need. And verse 2 says, "And behold, there was a certain man before him who had dropsy." I remember when I was a kid reading this and wondering, I ain't know what a dropsy is, you know what? And I'd look in other translations and I would look it up in the dictionary, and it just said it's dropsy. Dropsy is, that's what all the other translations say too, dropsy. It doesn't sound good. I mean, I did find one dictionary that defines it, and the word is hydropikos, which first part is from the word for water, and then the second part of it comes from the Greek word that means to appear or to seem, what we can see with our eyes, what we take in visually, and it means it's a type of edema, but it's a very serious type of edema. In fact, usually in the first century they thought it was fatal, but it was a symptom of something that was underlying. You know, the edema itself wasn't fatal, but it was usually something that was caused by something like repeated malarial fevers or something like that, and organs start to shut down, and so you start retaining water then. I mean, this wasn't just talking about he needed a good prescription for some water pills. You know, this was serious. His whole body was bloated from this dropsy, and I mean, every step he took was painful. You know, he could feel his feet squish underneath him because of all of this water that he was just every tissue in his body was saturated with, because his organs were starting to shut down, and a very serious situation. And this is not the sort of guy that would be invited to a Pharisee's house for shawarma, especially not the ruler of the Pharisees. You know, they don't have these kind of people over for dinner, but they invited this guy because they were going to see what Jesus would do with him. The whole thing's a setup. And so, seeing this, Jesus spoke to the lawyers. These would be the guys that were part of the group that their job was to interpret the law. That's why they were called lawyers. And so he sees the sick man. He sees Mr. Muckety Muck, and he looks over the lawyers, and he says, "Let me ask you a question. Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath?" I mean, for those that have been with us as we've been through this whole study in Luke, can you say deja vu? I mean, have we been here before or not? I mean, it seems like the only thing Jesus liked better than healing people was healing people on the Sabbath, right? Now, this is the fourth time just in Luke that we've seen it. And he says, is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath? Now, before we go into this, I think it would be worth stating that when it comes to interpreting the law, the lawyers, the people that would, more than just commentary. Weren't just commentators. They were the guys that said, "This is what that says. This is what that means." And when they first started doing that, you know, like for example, you shall not work on the Sabbath. All right, that's pretty straightforward, pretty clear. Until somebody raised the question, well, how do you define work? You know, is it just that what I get paid for? I mean, how do you define work? And so the lawyers went to work trying to define that. And in the beginning, I think that it was first done with good motives. You know, I think they had the people's and their own best intentions at heart. But then they came up with things like, well, if you cut yourself on the Sabbath, you can put a Band-Aid on it, but you can't put any antibiotic on it. You can't do anything that would begin to promote the healing, because that would be work. It would cause your body to work. And so you can't do that. You can just put a Band-Aid on your cut. They would say, you know, things like that. And just in time, as they were starting to define what work was, the whole thing shifted from what work was to just the externals. of what we do. Somebody said, well, what about if you got a really bad cut on the Sabbath? I mean, like, what if you sever an artery or something? Well, you can put a tourniquet on it. You can stop the bleeding so you don't die, but you can't do anything to start promoting the healing. Okay, all right, and so then say, well, what about, I got this chicken, and this chicken laid an egg on the Sabbath. What do I do with this chicken? What do I do with this egg? I mean, they call it labor for a reason, and so, do I stone the chicken? Do I throw the egg away? And so the rabbis thought, well, no, it's not the chicken's fault. Here's what you do. You can sell the egg to a Gentile on Sunday. And then that'll be okay. You can't do it on Saturday because you can't conduct business. But you wait till the next day, and then you can sell it to a Gentile. And as a result of that, the Sabbath keeping became somewhat of a source of pride. Because the laws were so meticulous. I mean, there were volumes and volumes in the Talmud that were written about this, about what you could and couldn't do on the Sabbath. And in time, it became the people that knew all those do's and don'ts were the elevated. They became the muckety-mucks. And so it became quite a source of pride. And all this is going on in the background. And all this is this like smokescreen from the real issue of here's this guy that is suffering. Is it lawful to heal him on this day, or do I make him suffer another 24 hours before I do anything about it? But they kept quiet. Verse 4. They couldn't answer him. There wasn't anything in the law that said anything about healing on the Sabbath because nobody had ever been healed before on the Sabbath. There's examples of the prophets here and there smattering over the 2,000-year history of the Jews, but they'd never had to deal with it before, so they kept quiet. And so he took him, the man with the dropsy, and he healed him, and then he let him go. That's all we read about it. The guy was probably in so much pain he couldn't even walk over to Jesus. Jesus had to walk over to him, and he just probably laid his hand on him. He probably hugged him as he prayed for him, and then all of a sudden, not only this bloated tissues, all of the pain that came from that, not only all of a sudden was that all gone, but whatever the underlying cause of it was, the organ failure, that was all gone. And he was healed. End of verse 4. Could you imagine how much jumping and leaping and dancing and praising not only the guy, but Jesus did? Jesus was probably just as happy as he was to see him to be delivered from one of this horrific manifestation of sin, of this painful disease. But the guy leaves, and things start to kind of simmer down a little bit there at the dinner party, and then he answered them, the lawyers that couldn't answer him with his question, he said, well, I'll answer it for you. Which of you, having a donkey or an ox that's falling into a pit, will not immediately pull him up out of the pit on Sabbath day? Now, my New King James, and if you've got the Old King James, you see it's the word donkey there. But if you're reading any other English translations, you have the word son there. And it's a manuscript thing. I don't know why. I don't know how they went from actually the majority of the manuscripts, the oldest, most reliable, and the vast majority of the manuscripts all say son. And I don't know how some scribe somewhere along the line, because they're not even the same word, not even similar to the same word. The guy must have had he didn't like his kid, is what I'm thinking it was. And so as he's going along one day, he said, well, I wouldn't pick my son up out of the pit, but I'd pick my donkey up. So he wrote that in. No, probably not that. I don't know how it happened, actually. But he said, which of you having a donkey or a son, in fact, some of the versions even say donkey, son, or ox, or sheep. They just kind of cover the whole spectrum. Which of you wouldn't pick them out if they fell into a pit on Sabbath day? And they couldn't answer that either. And so he told them a parable. He said a parable to those who were invited. And when he noted how they chose the best places, they're coming into this dinner party. And you got to understand that this is before Amy Vanderbilt's book on etiquette and Miss Manners and all that sort of stuff, And it was before. I mean, today you go to a dinner party and you got those little calligraphed name plates that tell you where you're supposed to sit and everything, and it's all nice. And they didn't have that back in those days. In fact, what would happen is when you were having a dinner party, you would send out 2 invitations. You'd first send out a specific one that would go to everyone. And once you got the people that you wanted, and once you got the RSVPs back from them, then you would send out a second invitation that was more general. These people would be allowed to come and take up whatever remaining seats they were, and then those that didn't make it in time would just sit around the perimeter and watch the festivities unfold before them. That's kind of how it was. Kind of the way that rich people could show off back in those days. And so as soon as they would open the door, as soon as that would be, once it was time, they would unlock the door and open it up, and there would be a mad dash by the multitude. The people, they would just come like pouring in, trying to get to a seat first. And it was just, Jesus had just observed all of this. And so he said, let me tell you a parable about that. When you're invited by anyone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in the best place, lest one more honorable than you be invited by him. And he who invited you and him come and say to you, give place to this man, and then you begin with shame to take the lowest place. He says, whenever you're invited to one of these things, don't be like crowding for position there at the front of the door so you can get in the door first. And then when the door's open, you're pushing everybody out of the way so you can be the first one to get to one of the best seats at the table. Because I tell you what, if the host comes up to you later and say, this seat's reserved for Rabbi Muckety-Muck, and then you have to get up and go sit at the card table where the kids are, that's going to be kind of embarrassing. And so he says to them, when you're invited, this is verse 10, when you're invited, go and sit down in the lowest place. Just when you're invited, when you go in, go sit at the card table with the kids. Go sit there first. And then when he who invited you comes, he may say to you, friend, go up higher. No, I want you up here at the table of honor. Jesus is saying, wouldn't that be a whole lot better than the other way around? And then you will have glory in the presence of those who sit at the table with you. And whoever exalts himself will be humbled, and whoever humbles himself will be seated. Well, like I said, today we have rules of etiquette. And there's a proper way to do it. We put the plates, and then there's the fork on the knife and the spoon and the napkin and the we have all of that. It's all planned out. We have the name tags and everything, and we've got all that today. So how does this apply to us? I mean, what would be the application to us when if Jesus were giving this parable today, he wouldn't say the same thing because we wouldn't relate to it. How would he address it today, do you think? 2 words. Potluck. Right? I mean, you're going to have the potluck, and you kind of go through and scope out the line beforehand. And you see that Sister Lulabelle has made some of her prize-winning smothered burritos. And there's 26 of them. But then when you get in line, you find yourself 27th in line. And you know that everybody else is going to get a smothered burrito because Sister Lulabelle's. What do? You look in front of you and you go, Brother Herbert, I think your fly is open. And then while he's busy taking care of that, you just kind of slide in front of him, right? Yeah, that's how it works. And this is this is what Jesus is talking about. It's all this kind of a thing about, oh gosh, we have this potluck this month. There's not as much food as there was last month. I better get in line quick. We've for the most part, on the first Sunday of every month, we've had a potluck at Calvary Chapel for over 25 years. And depending upon the calendar, some days we won't have one. Some months go by. But for 10 or 11 times a year, we'll have a potluck on the first Sunday of the month. And I can say to you that I have never gone hungry on a potluck Sunday. I never had to worry about it. I mean, if for some chance there wasn't enough food, there's a Sonic less than a half mile away, I mean, I've never like, oh gosh, I don't know what I'm going to do. There wasn't enough food today. I guess I'll just starve. But we treat that sort of thing as though it's like it's the end of the world, because if we don't get a burrito, what are we going to do? This is a culture in which pride was very highly exalted. It was considered to be a strength. Humility was considered a weakness, because people will walk all over you. Nobody else is going to look out for you, so you got to look out for number one. And this was a culture, not only in the Roman culture, where they treated pride as a god, even in the Jewish culture. That's the way it was viewed. And recognizing someone, saying, "Oh, brother, don't sit here at the kids' table. Why don't you come on up here to this place of honor?" That's not wrong. Jesus says, he gives that in his parable. And recognizing someone for what they've done, or who they are, or something like that, for their accomplishments or whatever, that's not wrong. Sometimes people say, "Oh, I don't want anybody to see me do this because I don't want to lose my blessing." And I don't know where that came from. That's not in the Bible. That's not a teaching of the New Testament. Having somebody see what you do does not rob you of your blessing. Doing it so it can be seen will rob you of your blessing. But recognizing somebody is biblical. Paul talks about people being worthy of double honor. But we gotta know that can have its downside. I've shared this before when in previous ministry, before we came to Oklahoma City. In fact, it was when we were moving here. We'd already. I was assistant pastor at this church in Kansas, and they were giving us a going away party. And basically, if you know what a roast is, that's essentially what this was. They had a table set up with our family, and we were sitting up there at the front. And then we had a dinner, and then there was a microphone with a lectern, and people started coming up, and they would make fun of Sherry and I. They would say some sort of funny things or some, just jokes, something of where we had messed up before or something like that. And then they would, of course, they would end by saying something nice. And it was fun. It was a very humbling experience, actually. But then the senior pastor, got up at the very end, and he started off by saying, "Ken Merrihew is the most humble man I've ever met in my life." And I will say to you that I have never had pride in my heart greater than that moment. I mean, it's a good thing I was wearing a T-shirt, because if I'd been wearing a button-up shirt, I'd have popped them all, And it's not wrong to recognize somebody, but we got to realize that it does kind of put us on thin ice, And I mean, some people get cheerful or get credit for being cheerful when they're just proud of their teeth. They just want to show off their teeth, and everybody says, "Oh, that guy's always so happy." No, he just got good caps. He wants to make sure everybody sees them. It's like Forrest Gump said, "Pride is like a dandelion." And it is. When you take a little kid and they go out into the yard. Well, they don't go into your yard because you don't have dandelions in your yard. But they go into your neighbor's yard, and they pick a dandelion and they bring it home and say, "Oh, Mommy, look at the pretty flower that I've got." And, of course, little kids call them blowflowers. And she goes, "Oh, I just got this really pretty blowflower that I picked for you, Mommy." And then she blows on it, and there's a million little blowflower seeds going onto your ground, And next thing you know, you're fighting the blowflower battle. Several years ago, when my first attempt at being a yard guy, and I had this philosophy. I had this my theology of being a yard guy was that if you just fertilize your ground really, really good, then your grass will become very healthy, and it'll choke out the weeds. And so one day I was down at the lawn guy store, and I was explaining to one of the guys about my feeling about that, and he says, "Weeds like fertilizer too." And he said, if you fertilize your ground that has weeds in it, you're just going to make them stronger than your grass. You got to kill the weeds first, then fertilize your ground. Pride is like a dandelion. And you just blow on it, and it spreads, and it takes root, and then it's just all over the place. Not only your neighbor's yard, but it's in your yard as well. And the only way you can get rid of it is to kill it. You probably heard of the 7 deadly sins. And it's there, I don't even know what they are, but there's that you can get some churches have what they call the 7 deadly sins. There actually are 7 deadly sins. They're not the ones that are normally listed, but we find them in Proverbs chapter 6. And Solomon writes in Proverbs 6, starting with verse 16, "These 6 things the Lord hates, yea, 7, are an abomination to him." These are the 7 deadly sins. These are the 7 things that the Bible says God hates. And we would think that the first thing on this list would be something like murder or child abuse or voting for whoever. We think that would be the thing that would be on the list. But the very first one on the list is a proud look. Oh, did I go past that? Yeah, okay. The first thing on the list is a proud look. List of all the things that God hates, the very first one that he gives has to do with pride. He says, then also, verse 12, he said to him who invited him, when you give a dinner or a supper, Jesus says, whether you're in the south or in the north, whatever you call it, dinner or supper, do not ask your friends, your brothers, or your relatives, nor rich neighbors, lest they also invite you back and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, and the maimed, the lame, and the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, and you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. I don't know if you ever heard of R.G. Letourneau or not. He had kind of had some struggles during the Depression. He was trying to get some things off the ground, but because of the economy, he was having a lot of trouble. He got in debt a couple times, and about the time he'd get out of debt, then he'd have some other thing. But he pioneered like modern day earth moving equipment, and a lot of these the big machines you see when they're doing road construction, those things that just kind of lay down a road as they go. He pioneered all that. And when his business first started taking off, when he first time he turned a profit, he was a very devout man, very solid Christian. And the first time that they started showing a profit in his company, he and his wife discussed it, and they decided rather than tithing, which is 10%, they were going to keep the tithe and give the 90%. And his entire life, he gave 90% of his income to the work of the Lord. Toward the end of his life, I heard where he was giving all of it away. He said, I got enough, I don't need any more. Great man of faith. There's a college down in East Texas named after him. He said, if we give only because it pays, it won't pay. And I see these commercials on TV, and especially this time of year, it's kind of the time when these sort of flourish, where it's these, you see kids and people that are in dire straits around the world, and they have some ministry that's going to come and, for your gift of $19 a month, you can feed this child, kind of thing. And this is not against any of that. Please don't misunderstand me with that. I'm not talking about those ministries and the work that they do. It's not an endorsement or a condemnation. But one of the things that I've seen when they start giving in the commercial, they have the little 10, 15-second testimonials of the people that support it. And I have never seen an exception to this. In every case, they'll say, I get such a good feeling inside knowing that I've done my part. And Jesus said, if you do that, then you've gotten your reward. That's it. You don't do it because it'll give you a good feeling. If you do it because it pays, then you won't get paid. And I think that this lesson that the Lord gives us is very timely for this time of year. We'll be having dinner parties and Christmas parties and things like that. And he says, when you do that, invite the people. Remember the people that don't get invited. And don't do it because somebody's going to, I'm going to invite them to our party this week, so they'll invite us to their party next week. Or don't do it because it gives you a good feeling because you invite people that don't get invited. You just do it because you should do it. Because it would please God. And if you get pleased in the process, that's incidental. Right? Let's pray. Got a tough lesson, I think, for many of us in the text today, but it's true. Help us, Lord, because we are so prideful. We have such a bent toward that. It happens so naturally. And then we live also in a culture today in which that's considered to be a strength. And weakness is humility. So help us in that, God, we pray. Make us more like Jesus, who was in every sense the humble servant. And it's in his name that we pray. Amen.